Hello, what a pleasure to be here. I'm tempted to ask all of you to get out of your chairs, lest I cause you harm, but I'll leave that up to you. Feel free to mill about. I won't be distracted. I want to talk to you today about the fact that I am a marketer, and you are all marketers. Doctors are marketers, and we're pretty lousy at it, and one of the problems is that we don't even acknowledge that it's what we do. There's a big opportunity to move from influence, the way we do as marketers, to collaboration with our patients and, for that matter, everyone else around us. And I want to talk to you about that for a few minutes today and share some ideas. So I was looking for an image for this presentation of a doctor listening to a patient. And so I asked Google to help me find one. And it was interesting what Google suggested. It suggested that perhaps I wanted a doctor listening to a heart or to a lung. But none of the top several solutions were a doctor listening to a patient. And that reflects the collective thinking, the collective culture that we have. The suggestions on Google are a result of all of the queries that ever come into Google. So we're not asking very much for images of a doctor listening to a patient. So I had to get a little more creative. And you'll give me and these girls the benefit of the doubt that they're actually collaborating in some way. And I want to talk about the idea of patient-centered care. So this idea has advanced. I suspect that very few of you in the room are uncomfortable with it. You probably think it makes sense and you understand it. And I suspect that the way many of you think about it, certainly the way that I have thought about it, is that patient-centered care means that we ask and think hard about the patient's preferences. What's their context? What's their belief system? What do they want? And as a result of understanding those preferences, that context, we then adjust our message, adjust the wisdom that we have, and share it with them in a slightly different way. And I think that's a very dangerous way of looking at it. I think it's a beginning, but it's very incomplete, and there are some challenges with it. So probably the most important challenge is that the world is getting very complex, very quickly. So the scientific basis of almost everything we do in medicine is changing under our feet. It's taking fewer and fewer years for half of what we know to become irrelevant or certainly incorrect. It's not just a velocity increase, it's an acceleration increase. And at the same time, the practice of medicine, as so many of you know, is not getting easier. This is a painful video of a friend of mine who I moonlight with in urgent care. And he has decades of experience as a cardiologist. I love listening to him talk about patients. Oftentimes I bring him in to help me remember how to listen to the heart properly. And now he spends less time with patients because he spends a bunch of time typing into a computer, and as you can tell, he sucks at typing. And so in this context where medicine logistically and practically is getting harder to practice, and the complexities underlying everything that we need to know and do are increasing exponentially, we need help. It probably won't surprise you to hear that I think the most underutilized resource in medicine is the patient. Patient-centered care today means that we need to listen to the patient and understand her context in order to deliver our knowledge in a way that will make sense to her, that she'll understand, that she'll agree to, that she'll comply with. But an opportunity is in front of us. There are huge numbers of people that want to collaborate with us, that want to collaborate with us to improve their care. And this doesn't just mean asking the patient what her preferences are. It means asking the patient, what do you think is wrong? What do you think we should do about it? What we can learn when we ask that question will blow you away. Now, the good news is patients aren't waiting for us to figure this out. I sometimes call this the syndrome of when smart people get sick. For example, in the online patient communities that I work with now, a common scenario is, hello, kidney cancer online community. I heard from a friend that I should join here. I have a question about how often I should be getting scanned. I'm not sure if I understood or fully agreed with what my doctor said, but I wasn't sure how to ask. And by the way, I've had my nephrectomy. I'm scheduled for the following chemo in a certain number of weeks, and I'm open to other comments people have. And within an hour, that person hears, welcome, you're not alone. With respect to your question, the data is imperfect. Here's a pointer to the best study that's been done to my knowledge. And here are a couple questions that I think would be reasonable to ask your clinician. And by the way, the plan that you have is consistent with what I've seen discussed on this group and my understanding of the literature. Although, if you do have that medicine first, it might have an implication on what chemotherapy you can have second. And here's a pointer to a discussion about that. And then several other people chime in on some of the nuances, and the aggregate wisdom is shared. Now, when I see patients, I am only just beginning to learn to inquire from the patient what he thinks and what his community thinks, if he, for whatever notion of community is appropriate here. But when smart people get sick, they do whatever they have to do for themselves or for their loved one to get the best care. And when I started seeing examples of these oncology communities, my first reaction was, I don't believe it. I gave up over a decade of my life in several ivory towers to become trained enough to understand these concepts. And there's some cognitive dissonance that I have if I see that 3 months after a diagnosis, a guy who knew nothing about healthcare before understands how to use PubMed better than I do. Now, the perhaps obvious point here is that that person whose loved one was diagnosed with renal cell carcinoma doesn't need to know anything about most of medicine. They just have one domain to understand, and they don't even need to understand renal physiology. They're not going to go and administer chemotherapy and keep the patient's kidney from running into trouble. They just need to understand what are the issues around the big diagnostic and treatment decisions, and how do I think about them. And it turns out they're not that hard to learn about if you're smart enough, and you have to. So there's this world of people out there that want to help us do our jobs. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time showing a basic flow of information, which is really a flow of influence. The traditional model, and the one that is tried and true at places like the Mayo Clinic, is that researchers come up with important questions and design experiments to answer those questions. The results are then made available to the world in the biomedical literature, often in the lay press as well. And then expert doctors, sometimes they're the same researchers, sometimes they're the clinicians collaborating with the researchers, are made aware of that because those are their colleagues, because they're on top of the literature in their field. And then eventually, months, usually years later, that gets out to what we often refer to as the community, or the doctors that practice not near centers of excellence, certainly not part of academic institutions like this one. And of course, it's the typical doctors that are seeing the typical patients, and that's how the information flows to patients. But what's happening increasingly, and this is not new, I just happen to have learned about it more recently and sharing it with some of you who probably have known about this for longer than I have, there are networks of patients who are learning to read the literature, who are asking each other questions, some of whom are in the centers of excellence, and they bring back wisdom from there and share it with, indirectly, share it with community doctors. Oops. And this flow of information from the scientific discovery all the way to the patients often happens in a few months instead of a few years. It shouldn't need to be this way, but it's what's happening organically, and I think there's a lot that we can learn from it. There's a lot that we can learn from our patients. So the magic of this is beautifully told by one of the more favorite books in my house, which is Swimmy. You folks know Swimmy? If not, please go. If you have 4, 5, 6-year-old kids, please go buy a copy of Swimmy. So Swimmy is the blackfish there. And at the beginning of the book, spoiler alert, for anyone, plug your ears if you're worried. At the beginning of the book, Swimmy is playing in his community, and a big tuna fish comes and gobbles them all up. Swimmy's fast, so he gets away. And he has some adventures through the book and learns about parts of the ocean that he wouldn't have otherwise discovered. And then he finds a bunch of his community hiding behind a big rock. And he says, oh, great, let's come out and play. And they say, we can't, we're afraid. We don't want to get eaten by the big tuna fish. So Swimmy says, no, it's okay, I have an idea. Come, just be with me in this configuration, and we'll look like a big fish, and then the tuna fish won't think that they can eat us, and we can go and do whatever we want. In fact, we can even chase the tuna around if we want, just for fun. And so what's happening here is it's the power of a network. And it's not just that there's one Swimmy who knows all the right answers and teaches people how to do things. In the fin there's a couple of people that know a whole bunch about one disease. In the tail, there are people who've studied very carefully the molecular basis of action of a new chemotherapeutic and what implications it has for other areas. Somewhere in the body, there's someone who has done a whole bunch of research, talked to several pharmacists, and figure out which cream is best for this side effect and which cream seems to work best for the other. Never been studied, probably never will be, but they're sharing this knowledge with each other. And when someone comes to the question, they're not asking one individual, they're asking the network. There's a really interesting book whose title is Too Big to Know. The subtitle is what really gets me. The subtitle is, When the Smartest Person in the Room is the Room. And today, too often, we're practicing medicine alone. I think in a few decades, I'll look back at the way I'm practicing today and think, how stupid of me to be making decisions all by myself. So we have an opportunity. And the opportunity is to ask more, with even more humility than we bring to our practice today. What do we not know? And what do our patients know? And how can we learn from them and with them? There are armies of motivated citizen scientists out there who want to help us do our jobs better and take better care of them. And the amount that we can learn and how quickly we can learn it, I think, could increase easily by an order of magnitude if we embrace that opportunity. Thank you for your attention.
Caught me there. Well done on the clock, by the way.
Thank you.
So what is the difference between the smart patient who acquires knowledge from a domain that you consider authoritative versus a smart patient who spent the same intellectual energy and comes up with Laetrile or comes up with this scientist in Siberia who does this treatment that I heard about, kind of thing? How do you deal with that?
So there's two important aspects of that. One is I think that this model, this way of thinking, is most important for us in areas where we know that we don't always know the best answers, in areas where the science is weak or moving quickly, and patients understand that too. How I'm learning that solid communities deal with it is that a patient who comes into one of these communities and says, my brother just got back from Siberia, and he got treatment X. He's doing great. Someone will respond, any studies to back this up? Question mark. And if the answer is no, that person who made the statement will say, best of luck to you and your brother. We don't know what to do with that information. We don't talk about it here.
So it's really the collective intelligence that drives the authority.
It's a culture.
And is there also an innovative piece in the sense that one might suspect that a culture like this would drive even someone like you to consider therapies that are not Laetrile or the Soviet guy in Siberia? I don't know why I'm trashing the Russians today. There's something wrong with me. But is something that hasn't been tried. There have been a number of therapies in all fields of medicine that are out on the fringe for a while and then are only lately embraced, and sometimes embraced by patients who decide that they're going to take the risk, the doctors be damned. Are these innovative drivers here?
So I think that they are, but that's actually not what I'm talking about. I don't understand that well enough. I've still got a lot of ivory tower in my blood. So really what I'm talking about here is the fact that, you know, there are now old studies that say the time from a bona fide important scientific discovery made on the bench, getting through everything, and then getting out to the community physician is 17 years. I don't think it's that long anymore, but I still think it's measured in years. And so here what we're talking about is the fact that if I'm, say, a community oncologist, and I see a handful of patients with leiomyosarcoma every year, and those patients are hanging out with 100 people who in turn, a few of which have doctors who are on the cutting edge, that the fastest way for me to learn what's the most important new information in the last 6 months about that disease may very well be by asking my patient. She has much more time and perhaps a controversial statement, more motivation to be as current as humanly possible than I do with the broad array of things that I'm responsible for.
So then in that particular conversation and dialogue, you become not so much the here's something you might think about, but you instead become, all right, that's interesting what you found, let me determine how valid some of those options are. It's a significant change for the ivory tower doctor. It's
a collaboration. I mean, you used the word collaboration in your opening remarks, and it resonated very strongly with me. It's a collaboration where if you're my physician and I tell you about something, first of all, I'm only going to tell you if I feel like you're interested in listening. And if I tell you about something, you're going to say, wow, great, let me look into that. Send me whatever pointers you have, and I'd like to study it, understand it, and see if it makes sense in the context of everything else, which parenthetically, you may not have, the patient may not have the full context of everything else.
As someone who's worked in medicine for how long?
15 years.
15 years. And as someone who understands how research happens, and scientists say this to me a lot, and not necessarily in medicine exclusively, but you know, in physics and astrophysics, there's often a real backstory in the schools of different lines of research. There's the superstring theorists, and then there's the you know, anti-string theorists, that sort of thing. How is this collective intelligence of this lay audience to decipher and decode the backstory, interagency, inter-institutional rivalries that drive certain strands of research and figure out where the real breakthroughs and valid treatments are? Do you have to help them with that, or do they get it on their own?
So, some of the fascinating and frankly uncomfortable conversations that sometimes go on in these communities is, here's what they will tell you at this institution, and here's what they will tell you at this institution. And we may not fully understand why, but one of the backstories that I've learned about is that Institution X tends not to offer this therapy, apparently because they had a really bad experience with it early on, and the politics are such that they don't want to touch it again. But for many patients, it may be the best therapy. So, you know, some of this is solved by transparency. Transparency in healthcare has a long way to go. There are a very understandable market-driven competition that in many ways results in better care, and in some ways probably hinders good care.
So in a sense, this collective intelligence constitutes a higher res accountability to simple peer review.
In some ways it does. I mean, I'll comment somewhat obliquely, and it's amazing to me that in my years of practicing medicine, there have been almost zero cases of someone assessing how good of a job I'm doing. That makes me uncomfortable. I think it should make all of us uncomfortable. I think the goal of understanding the opportunity that you know, these informed, educated, smart, expert patients have, the goal is not, let's use this as a form of accountability and transparency. I'm not sure that would be a terrible secondary effect. The goal is, we can do better faster if we embrace the wisdom that there is. Now, the solution is not, absolutely not, for every doctor to say to every patient, email me constantly, I'm gonna read all of your tweets, and I'm now subscribed to your RSS feed, because the signal-to-noise ratio would just be totally impractical. But if there are constructs out there, such as, I'm sure not limited to, but such as these communities that have this culture of self-monitoring, these communities that are fundamentally interested in, and often good at understanding science, if we can tap into those, we can do a better job much more quickly than we are today.
All right, tell me a story here at the end. You describe with a real sense of sincere amazement the extent to which you've come around to this expertise that patients are delivering to you, which makes me, as a fishy journalist, think that there are some stories in there of where, and I don't want to use deliberately inflammatory terms, but I don't have a better term than argument. I suspect you may have lost an argument with a patient who had something he or she wanted you to consider. You resisted for a while, but were eventually won over. Can you tell me such a story if you have one?
Oh, shit. So I'm embarrassed to say that I'm sure the answer is yes, and I've suppressed every instance of it. I'll share a story that comes to mind, and is going to make me look like cheesy, patting myself on the back, so apologies in advance. I was in the process of learning about one aspect of this, and I was seeing patients and checking email between patients, please don't tell anyone, and I got an email from one of my colleagues on this project who had sent me a piece that he wrote about, it was actually poetry, it's a long story, but it was about really listening. And so the patient that the story was actually about a fictional diabetic patient, older diabetic man. I walk in to see my next patient. It's an older diabetic man. And I work in a hospital that's got a lot of Spanish-only speakers. We're speaking in Spanish. And this guy's not taking his diabetes meds. It's a pretty straightforward, I should say, pretty common situation. Obviously, there's been a disconnect over many visits about how important this is, what this means for his long-term happiness, right? Not just some sort of geeky outcome, but his happiness. But instead of going through my standard, let's talk about the implications for your feet and for your kidneys and for your heart and for your eyes, I had a conversation with him that went something like, so what's really important to you? And he looked at me like, oh, God, what are we going to talk about now? And I said, so this week, what's the most important thing in your week? And so he gets on that, first of all, I'm not going to back off, and that I seem to be sincere. And he says, playing with my new grandkid. Okay, so let's talk about what you need to play with your grandkid. And we talked about his feet and his eyes in that context. I don't have any proof that was actually effective, but it seemed like the most useful interaction I had with a patient that day. Pretty much completely off topic from this talk. That was more about the sort of previous iteration of patient-centered care where we understand their perspective and their context, not just learning about them from a scientific basis. But I think if we sometimes, I'm a little uncomfortable right now because I'm higher than you. I've been proud of the fact that I've learned to try to sit a little bit lower than patients because I feel like it gives them permission to be more open with me. But I think maybe the right thing is to try to sit directly even with patients and to emphasize the fact that it's a collaboration.
Well, we could get a chair out for you next time. That
sounds good.
Roni, that was great. I think the takeaway there is the expertise of patients has to be mobilized by understanding their passions and what they're concerned about. And once you see that fusion, then you really have a door that's unlocked to be able to communicate. Thanks so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.